Good evening. I'm Jay Violet Gannon, the Executive Director of your Manchester Community Library. And on behalf of the library, I'd like to welcome you to what promises to be a most engaging conversation. When Ed and I were brainstorming about tonight, he was committed to creating a space where a diversity of audience voices and opinions could be heard. And to that end, I'm delighted that we have representatives from a range of institutions reflecting different backgrounds and a myriad of lived experiences. The range of individuals in the audience tonight will only enhance this learning opportunity for us all. The format of this evening, just to give you a little bit of a heads up, is as follows. Dr. Cameron will deliver a 30-minute presentation, after which we'll invite the panelists to contribute to the conversation for around 45 minutes. The remaining time will be devoted to your questions and comments. And before we begin, I would like to thank you all for making us a part of your evening and for supporting your local Manchester Community Library. So some brief introductions and biographies of the really stellar cast that we have this evening. Ed Cameron holds a doctorate in social sciences, business, and economics from Abo Akademi University in Finland. He works with governments, businesses, and international organizations, as well as nonprofits and academic institutions, as long as philanthropic organizations, to shape policies and design strategies that will build a just, sustainable, and prosperous world. He spent 23 years working on climate change, economic development, and human rights in both the public and private sectors, and his portfolio includes work on 5 continents with some of the world's leading organizations and companies. He's also a prolific writer, a media consultant, frequently sought out as a trusted source. Originally from Ireland, Ed makes his home here in Manchester, and we're fortunate to have such talent living and working in our community. We greatly appreciate his time this evening. Our next panelist is Jillian Joyce. Jillian teaches humanities and social studies right around this corner from the library at Burton Academy. She coordinates the service program and is a faculty advisor to the Student Environmental Club. Jillian's currently a Roland Fellow, studying climate change and education in Vermont. She was the founding teacher at Burton's Mountain Campus and has been an adult mentor for the Vermont Youth Lobby and the Climate Leaders Academy. Jillian graduated from Dartmouth College with a degree in history and holds a master's degree in science and environmental studies from Green Mountain College. Prior to teaching at BBA, she was the sustainability coordinator at St. Stephen's and in St. Agnes School in Alexandria, Virginia. She has a passion for engaging young people to use their voices in actions that strengthen our community, state, and the world. Our next guest is Ethan Koss-Smith, a native Californian. He's the coordinator for sustainable initiatives at Bennington College, where he's in his final year of studying music and advancement of public action. Ethan represents the Center for the Advancement of Public Action on the Student Education Policies Committee, and he's the founder of the student organization Leaders for Ecological Stewardship and Sustainability. And last but not least, we have Shricha Pradhan, an international student at Bennington College from Kathmandu, Nepal. Her academic work focuses on environmental studies, community action, and entrepreneurship. She has been contributing to sustainable efforts on her campus as a continuous energy improvement intern and throughout the student organization, Leaders for Ecological Stewardship and Sustainability. She also serves as the Environmental Studies Student Educational Policies Representative at Bennington College and is passionate about animal rights and ecosystem conservation, and is currently interning at the Center for Biological Diversity. Before we proceed any further, I'm going to hand things off to our technology librarian, Ray Stevens, and she's going to give you a little bit of the guidelines around the Zoom call this evening. Ray?
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. I have just a couple of quick remarks to make about the format of the call this evening. The first is that this is being recorded so that we can share it with those who were not able to join us tonight, or that if all of you would like to revisit it later, you'll be able to on our website. The way that we're going to produce the video is that none of you will appear on screen. It will only be the speakers for the evening that will end up in the published product. With that said, however, if you don't wish to appear in any sort of recording at all, even one that will be kept private, or if it poses a challenge to your internet connection, you are welcome to turn your cameras off. Otherwise, we would invite you to keep them on because it does give our speakers something of the experience of having a live audience. And we want them to feel your presence here tonight as well. The way in which we will be taking questions this evening, due to the large nature of the group who has joined us, is that Cal Workman, our events point at the MCL, is going to be collecting your questions as you post them in the chat throughout the meeting. So whenever you think of something that you would like to ask, you are welcome to type it into the chat and hit enter. Cal will collect those up and collate them, and they will be used during the panel portion of the evening and in the final Q&A. Finally, if you find yourself wishing to focus in on the speakers or to see the entire group of people, I just want to draw your attention to the view button that's in the top right-hand corner of your screen, where you can switch back and forth between the gallery view, which shows you everyone, and the speaker view. So that will be an option for you that is just a personal preference that you'll have whenever we are not sharing the PowerPoint presentation that Ed is going to use. With that said, Ed, if you would like to take it away.
Thank you very much. Let me first and foremost see if I can take care of the technology component and ask whether everybody can see the slide deck. You can, okay.
You're looking good.
Before we get started, I do want to say, of course, that yesterday we had serious events taking place in Washington, D.C., and it's been described by many of our political leaders and many in the media as an assault on the citadel of democracy. And one of the things that you'll find throughout tonight's presentation, sometimes subtly and sometimes rather clumsily, are references to yesterday and to the wider moment that we find ourselves in. To begin with, and rather clumsily, I do want to say that although the Capitol building in DC is a citadel of democracy, our community library is also a citadel of democracy, because this is where we come to learn. It's where we're educated about the issues that we grapple with in our world on a daily basis. It's where we develop a shared understanding of common facts that enable us to have robust debates about how we respond to the world around us. It's where we get to meet people from diverse backgrounds and forge a sense of community. It's also where we get to gather and iron out disputes through robust conversation. So I want to start my presentation this evening by sincerely thanking everybody who works at the library, everybody who donates to the library, for making sure that this continues to be a citadel for our community and for all the towns surrounding. And I also want to thank my fellow panelists this evening for joining and for illustrating that there are constructive ways in which you can engage in debate. There are constructive ways in which you can engage in disputes within community through advocacy and through activism and through intelligence. And I'm very, very honored that we have such a diverse group of people tonight that I'll be able to share this conversation with. With that being said, let's get started. Let me see if I can do this. Here we go. So I'm not going to bore you with my biography because I've already been introduced, and many of you on the call, I think, have heard about this story before. The only thing I will say is that over the course of the last 23 years, what I've always tried to do is to reconcile our need to protect the planet with our need to create a shared prosperity. They are not in conflict. They are mutually reinforcing. They are both necessary at the same time. Tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the concept of a moonshot, the concept of a climate moonshot in particular, and the conditions that enable us to aspire to big, ambitious goals during the course of this coming decade. Now, I want to start off by talking about why the term moonshot has become very much in vogue over the course of the last number of years. Of course, the most prominent reason is that it calls back to a time in US and world history when a president set a big vision in front of the nation and provided us with not only a timeline, but with the resources necessary in order to realize that particular vision. The moonshot historically has been a story about how we respond to crisis. In the 1950s, it was the crisis of the so-called missile gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was a feeling that the democratic world was being left behind by innovation and technological progress within communist countries. It was a sense that the best years of the United States had passed. It was a feeling that the United States was threatened by the fact that a rocket sent into the orbit by the Soviet Union could one day carry warheads that could be used, of course, to decimate cities across the nation. So it's a story of crisis, but it's also a story of vision. It's about how leadership in the public sector can set a vision that an entire government at the federal level, but also across states, can respond to. It's about how that vision in the public sector can mobilize the private sector. It's about how individuals and communities across the nation can play their part in responding to a vision. It's about government setting ambition, not just taking care of incremental progress, not just taking care of the nuts and bolts of daily life, but actually aspiring to something that transcends party, that even transcends generation, that transcends presidencies. Because the story of the Moonshot started with a Republican president, moved on to 2 Democratic presidents, but this particular moon landing image that we see here was realized under another Republican president. So it's also a story about how we can create that passing of the baton from one party to the next, from one leader to the next, from one generation to the next, in order to realize big goals and harvest, finally, big opportunities. Because one of the other stories of the Moonshot is how our investment in response to crisis was able to create new economic opportunity, new scientific discoveries that continue to aid our progress to this very day. There's another reason why we're talking about the Moonshot, and that is because we've reached an inflection point. We have politicians, President-elect Biden and Secretary Kerry, who will take over a position in the White House shortly that will coordinate international efforts around climate change. Those leaders and others in recent years have been using the term Moonshot to describe the scale of ambition and the level of urgency that needs to be invested in our attempt to manage the climate crisis. So the word itself and the concept has become fashionable, but another reason why now is pivotal is because we face what is called a decisive decade on the issue of the climate crisis. We have stalled and delayed for decades. In fact, by coincidence, the first ever report on climate change was handed to President Lyndon Johnson in 1965, as that very same president was navigating the investments into the space program. So for more than 60 years, we have known that this was a coming crisis. For more than 60 years, there has been a process of US leadership followed by US withdrawal that has hindered our global efforts to turn this crisis into a moment of opportunity to build a new economy. We now, over the coming decade, have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 45%. If we do not do that, we will breach thresholds, social and ecological, that sustain life and prosperity on this earth. So we have to begin again, but we also have to begin in a way that is different. We cannot go back, for example, to the incremental progress that we saw under the Obama administration any more than we can go back to the climate denial of the current administration. One of the things that has struck me over the course of the last 24 hours, and indeed over the course of the last number of weeks, is that there's another important reason why we must do this now. And that is because we actually need in this country a shared program, a shared project that constitutes a vision of shared progress. The quotes that you can see on this particular slide could very easily be used and very easily be understood as quotes about Joe Biden or quotes about this particular moment in time. But in fact, these quotes are from 1976. The first quote is about President Carter and about the sense that the country had of a president coming to office whose main job was to heal the wounds of Watergate and Vietnam. And the second quote is advice that was given to President Carter right before his inaugural address, where his advisors were saying to him, you must come up with a shared project for this broken country to heal our divisions and to restore our battered psyche. And what he decided to do with this was to create a focus on human rights in American foreign policy that had not existed before. We had the opposite of a focus on human rights under Henry Kissinger, of course. So one of the things we have to think about now is not just why we can respond to the climate crisis as an act of environmental stewardship, but why responding to that crisis provides an opportunity to heal the deep divisions in American psychology that have emerged not just over the course of the last 4 years, but have been brewing over the course of the last many decades. For me personally, I've spent far too long over the last 4 years explaining a president to the world and to comrades and colleagues right across this nation. I've spent an awful lot of time as a consultant speaking to governments and speaking to companies around the world, helping them to understand what the Trump presidency meant for their business and for our prospects on climate change. Tonight is an opportunity for me to actually sunset the explanation of a failed presidency and instead to provide some advice as to what the next presidency ought to look like in terms of leading us to a better future. So tonight, what we're going to do is first and foremost talk about what the climate moonshot actually looks like. And then we're going to talk about what are the various ingredients that should be a first day priority for the new president when he takes office on the 20th of January. So the first thing to do to make sure we're all starting from the same basis of understanding is to talk about the climate crisis itself. There's a couple of things I want everybody to be aware of. The first is that this is a global crisis. It is not the problem of people living in a distant land. It affects every single one of us, irrespective of where we live. The second thing I want you to be aware of is that this is not tomorrow's problem. This is today's problem. It is something we are experiencing already and have been over the course of the last decades already. The third thing is that this is not an environmental problem. This is a human problem. It is caused by humans and it affects us in our everyday lives. It affects where we live. It affects our health. It affects our jobs. It affects every facet of our human rights. You see, for example, from this slide, that more than 9 million people die premature deaths every year as a consequence of air pollution related to the burning of fossil fuels. Think of what we would be doing to our economy if we were faced with such a global public health crisis. Of course, you don't have to think, we're dealing with it with COVID. So why are we responding to COVID with such urgency, and yet on an annual basis, we neglect the millions of people around the world who are dying prematurely because of the climate crisis? What we also have to recognize is that we're experiencing massive economic damage in the here and now, money that could be better directed to social services like health and education as a consequence of failing to address the climate crisis. We've had a massive increase in the number of extreme weather events, not just hurricanes and cyclones, but also things like wildfires, heat waves, and public health emergencies like vector and waterborne diseases that have led us to lose countless amount of lives, but also have lost in excess of $3 trillion in recent decades. The Financial Stability Board, which is not Greenpeace and which is not the Sierra Club, it's the central bankers of the world, have come together and said we're at risk of losing $43 trillion by the end of this century to global climate change. That is more than half the global economy. And those people who tell you that it is too costly for us to act on this issue, what they fail to tell you is that we're already in the United States paying a climate disaster tax. In 2017 alone, Congress appropriated enough money to represent $1,000 for every American taxpayer to cover the losses related to climate events. But importantly, the other news that we must remember is that the climate crisis can be turned into an opportunity to build a new climate economy, because all of the technologies and all of the innovations that we need in our energy system, in our transportation, and in our food system, all of those innovations and technologies are known to us, they are available to us. The real question is, do we have the imagination? Do we have the political will? Do we have the courage? Do we have the boldness necessary to take innovation, to take technology, to mobilize the finance, to deliver the laws, to make the changes in our own lifestyles and our behavior, to realize a vision of a new future? And what does that vision look like? It's no longer enough that we simply reduce greenhouse gas emissions to safeguard a livable chemical composition in the atmosphere. It's no longer enough that we focus on decarbonization. That is the urgent imperative of this decade, to make sure that we hold global mean temperatures below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius of rise. That is how we avoid unmanageable climate change. But if by the end of this decade, we have started down the road of decarbonization, and yet there are still 22,000 children dying of hunger every single day, and there are still 40% of Americans who cannot absorb a $400 emergency expense, then we will have failed as a society to create the type of economy that our wealth suggests we're able to create. So we must expand our vision. We must not only concentrate on low carbon development, but we must create a shared prosperity, an inclusive economy that strengthens civil and political rights, that expands economic opportunities for all, but that also gives a just transition to this new economy to those who are heavily dependent on fossil fuels. We cannot leave Appalachia behind as we're creating a shared prosperity for the rest of us. And similarly, as we work to avoid unmanageable climate change, we must manage unavoidable climate change, the climate change that is already happening on a daily basis as a consequence of past activity. Now, I put this in front of you as an illustration that a restoration to what we have done before and simply resuscitating the policies of previous administrations are not going to be enough. Therefore, we need a bigger, bolder vision. We need far more creativity for what the president-elect does when he takes office on the 20th of January. So, in terms of what the president could do, and I have to say in advance, some of these things are quite coherent, and some of these things are actually choices that we will have to make, paths that we will have to choose between. But here are the things that I've outlined that I think should be a part of the menu of options that the president begins to draw from on the 20th of January. The first is setting that suitable vision as a way of mobilizing us as a society, but also as a way of mobilizing all of the various actors in our society that we are heavily dependent upon for this transition to a new climate economy. The financial services sector, those innovators, those technology leads in the tech sector, for example. So we need a vision. The second is we need to put in place the right personnel. There's an old adage in Washington, D.C. that personnel equals policy. If you don't have the right leaders in place, then the bureaucracy does not respond with the right level of ambition. The third is we need to return the United States to climate diplomacy. That doesn't just mean returning to the Paris Agreement. It means going far beyond the Paris Agreement. It means we must work to build a societal consensus by returning to science, by offering a language of idealism, and importantly, by creating what I call an environmentalism of everyday life. And then finally, we must revitalize American democracy, understanding that this is a journey we're embarking upon that will take many decades. And therefore, we have to prepare our democracy as a whole to respond to that particular journey. Now, I'm going to go through each of these in detail. First, let's talk about the vision. Now, just as there are conceptions and misconceptions about President Trump, there are also conceptions and misconceptions about President-elect Biden. And one of the potential misconceptions, and I do hope it's a misconception, is that he is a safe pair of hands who is going to be extremely moderate and extremely centrist, and who is going to do things in a very incremental way. There's reason to believe that he is that type of person if you look at his record, but there's also reason to believe that there may be a spark of creativity and imagination there. So for example, if you look at the policy that has been set by the incoming transition team, that policy is drawn from something called the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force. So right after Joe Biden won the nomination, he convened, along with Bernie Sanders, a series of committees that were designed to reconcile the center Democrat view with the progressive Democrat view. And on a whole range of different issue areas, they came out with visions for what they would work on if elected to office. It has to be said that the climate vision that they have come up with is the most comprehensive and the most ambitious of any candidate for the presidency in American history. It still is not equal to what some international peers like the European Union are committing to, but in terms of its breadth, looking far beyond energy into other issues such as transport, agriculture, industrial processes, city development, and so on, it is extremely ambitious. In terms of its depth, the types of targets it sets and the types of timelines it puts in place for those targets, it's extremely ambitious. in terms of its understanding, its proper diagnosis as climate, as a socio-ecological problem, not just an environmental problem, it's extremely sophisticated. In terms of its focus on issues of marginalization and vulnerability and environmental racism, it's extremely pioneering. And in terms of its understanding that we must not only respond to crisis, but we must create economic development opportunities, it's far-sighted. So when it comes to the issue of vision, the incoming administration scores very, very highly, not just in relative terms to the previous administration, but in absolute terms in terms of meeting the moment of where we are today. When we look, however, at what the personnel in the incoming administration looks like, we very much have a mixed bag. So there are examples of, first and foremost, a structure of government that meets the moment. We have, for example, created not only an Office of Climate Mobilization within the White House that looks at international climate policy, but we've also created an office that looks at domestic climate policy. That is very, very important, because it's not enough for the United States to go around the world preaching decarbonization, especially when the United States' own record on this is so poor. What's really urgently needed is a domestic focus over the coming years. So we have John Kerry, who has very, very strong credentials internationally, leading the international push. But we also have domestically Gina McCarthy, a former administrator of the Environmental Protection Agency with very solid environmental credentials, leading the domestic push. That's very important. It means that they will have the ear of the president. It means that they will be able to focus on joined up government. Secretary Kerry will be able to work with the State Department, but he'll also be able to work with USAID, and he'll be able to influence the voting share that the United States has in places like the World Bank. Administrator McCarthy, on the other hand, will be able to make sure that we're working on climate, not just in the Environmental Protection Agency, but across all of the different agencies and departments of government. We have Deb Haaland and Michael Regan. Deb Haaland appointed to the Department of Interior and Michael Regan appointed to lead the Environmental Protection Agency. What's very important about their nominations is the fact that they are long-standing advocates of environmental justice and not just long-standing advocates of a switch from fossil fuels to renewable energy. It means they understand the disproportionate impact that environmental degradation has on low-income groups and on populations of color. And it also means that they will have their eyes wide open for any policy responses that further jeopardize those communities. Interestingly, both of these people were also appointed when other candidates far more prominent than they were initially identified as leaders within the cabinet. And specifically, they were appointed because there was a sense that the other potential nominees were not strong enough on environmental justice. So that's a very important appointment. However, there are some negative appointments. Tom Vilsack, for example, stands out and has been correctly labeled as an agent of big ag. He has been a long-standing lobbyist. He is representative of the revolving door policy in Washington, D.C., where you spend 4 years in government, go off and earn a fortune working for companies, spend your time lobbying to roll back environmental legislation, and then find yourself back in the hot seat again, making policies once more. He is not historically an advocate for low carbon and resilient practices in agriculture, and it's very, very hard to see him suddenly becoming a convert to the cause. So Tom Vilsack is somebody that we have to watch very closely. And then beyond the good and the bad, there are those members of the cabinet who really need to be engaged and need to be leading, but it's unclear whether they have an understanding of climate change sufficient to the job that they'll have. There's an argument that can be made, and I will make it in a few moments, that Janet Yellen is in fact the most important person in the cabinet when it comes to climate change. Because over the course of the coming months and years, we will undoubtedly need more economic rescue package. We will undoubtedly need more stimulus, and it will be Janet Yellen who is negotiating that stimulus with members of Congress. If she is not able to go in to those negotiations and advocate for a low carbon stimulus rather than what we've had up until this point, which is bailouts of fossil fuel companies, then anything we might achieve in other parts of government will be lost. And then a final thing that I will say on the issue of personnel. I have personally been very dismayed at the idea of this being a government of restoration rather than a government of transformation. There are far too many people coming into this government at the cabinet level and at the sub-cabinet level who are holdovers from the Obama era. And as much as we might respect what President Obama did on this issue 12 years ago, those same people are not of this moment. They do not have the creativity. They do not have the commitment to transformation that is needed in this decade. And so as time goes forward, it's going to be very important to see whether they actually embrace more of a vision of transformation than they have in their previous terms. Now, if we move on to policies, one of the things, of course, that will be immediately on the agenda for President Biden will be to resurrect what are called executive orders. Executive orders are the policies that a president is free to make using presidential authority rather than having to craft legislation with Congress. And it is executive orders that enabled President Obama to enact all of the climate leadership that the US showed under his term in office. There has actually never been any climate legislation passed by the United States Congress. All of the things we've seen before are executive orders, and all of those executive orders stem from a 2007 court case called Massachusetts versus EPA. The president has at his disposal, when he comes to office, more than 277 different policies that can be enacted through executive orders. And up to 54 are executive orders that can be initiated immediately on climate change. This includes, for example, reinstating executive orders that we did have under Obama, such as, for example, the Clean Power Plan, which seeks to sunset coal-fired power plants and provide much more incentive to generating and purchasing renewable energy. It includes the CAFE standards, which leads to more fuel-efficient vehicles. It involves reinstating what's called the California waiver, which enables California to set higher environmental standards than the federal standards, and which in turn allows other states to follow the California standard rather than the federal one. But it also includes different types of executive orders that Obama did not use. For example, federal public procurement. The federal government spends almost $600 billion annually on public contracts. This is sometimes, for example, to purchase food. It involves all manner of different types of public procurement using public money. One of the things President Biden should do immediately is issue an executive order mandating that all of those federal contracts, all of that $600 billion should be low carbon. That is not just a policy, that is a stimulus and an incentive to the real economy to begin to decarbonize as well. And by the way, that very same federal initiative should be followed by every state in the nation, including Vermont. Because if we were to follow that model, we would be mobilizing $1.5 trillion in economic stimulus towards decarbonization. The reason why we have to do that, the reason why we have to go beyond the executive orders of the Obama administration is because even under Obama's leadership, we were failing on the issue of climate change. We had a US target for emissions reductions that was far below our industrialized nation's peers, and we were also far behind in terms of meeting that target. So simply putting in place the executive orders that we've had before are not sufficient. So we need to go beyond executive orders. And one of the things that I am suggesting is that we need to really focus on the issue of stimulus. Up until now, over the course of the last 9 to 12 months of the COVID pandemic, more than $12 trillion has already been spent globally in response to the public health emergency and the economic crisis that it precipitated. You can see from this graphic on the right-hand side that most of the money that is being spent across the G20 nations of the world has not been used to build a new economy. It has in fact been used to bail out the old economy. And the reason why that is such a fundamental mistake is in part because the old economy was failing us on social, economic, and environmental issues, but it's also because that level of money will not be found again for another generation. So we have to spend this money wisely now, or we run the risk of waiting another 25 years to have the capacity to act. Now, of course, we know that more stimulus is on the way. I received my check this week. We know that more stimulus will be necessary over the course of the coming months and years. So it is absolutely vital that governments around the world put in place the right sorts of design principles and practical steps to green stimulus packages. Around spring of last year, I wrote a book. I know the library is stocking the book. Northshire Bookstore is also stocking the book. And it recommended 4 different design principles and 15 different recommendations for how we put together a stimulus that could lead to a low carbon, resilient and inclusive world. And I want to give you a sense of just a couple of things that are mentioned within those recommendations. One of them, for example, is the establishment of green banks. In this case, there is a draft piece of legislation that has been proposed in Congress to establish a national climate bank. This is something that former Congressman Ed Markey of Massachusetts has been very much to the fore of in terms of advocating. And I know that there's a lot of work underway right across New England to persuade other members of Congress from this region to back the idea of a national climate bank. And the idea is to initially fund the climate bank with $35 billion in federal funds, but over the course of time, to use that to leverage more than $1 trillion in total investment. And this would be extremely important in terms of building the energy, transport, and other types of infrastructure that we need to decarbonize. But it would also be an investment in the jobs of tomorrow. It would be an investment in weatherization. It would be an investment in jobs in renewable energy, and so on and so forth. There are other models around the world that we can look to as we seek to try and build not only a national but state level green banks in the United States. One of the most important is the European Investment Bank in the European Union, which recently committed to spending $1 trillion over the course of this decade on decarbonization within the 27 member states of the European Union. Second thing that we need to do is not just spend more money, but generate more money in ways that are equitable. And one of the ways we can do that is to cut back on the ridiculous amounts of money that are currently used to subsidize fossil fuels. These are called perverse incentives. We are actually paying public money to purchase something that causes public harm, and that is fossil fuels. A lot of the initial stimulus money that we spent during 2020 has gone to bailing out the coal, oil, gas industries. And if you look at this statistic from the International Monetary Fund, again, not an environmental organization, very, very classically economics in its focus, you'll see that about 6.5% of global GDP, or $5 trillion, was spent on fossil fuel subsidies in 2017 alone. This means that the price of fossil fuels is kept artificially low. And if this price was taken away, of course, the price point, the competitive price point of renewable energies would be even better than it currently is. But it also means that this money that we're directing towards fossil fuels could be directed towards funds and investments that cause social and environmental good. Another policy area for us to focus on is something that Senator Warren of Massachusetts has advocated for. And that is for the president to declare a national state of emergency to deal with the climate crisis at 1 minute past noon on the 20th of January. This would again open up more than 100 different special provisions that would not otherwise be available for the president, 130 different public policy areas that would not be dependent on Congress in order for the president to deal with this issue. And one of the most important would be the ability to set border tax adjustments. Now, again, there's precedent for this in other parts of the world. The European Union right now is looking at bringing in border tax adjustments so that they can impose tariffs on goods and services coming into the European Union that are high carbon. Why on earth should we be allowing goods and services to come into our country that destroy our environment as well as undercutting our domestic economy? So the European Union is working on this. The president could work on this as well as one of many things he could do if he were to declare a national emergency. Moving to climate diplomacy, we have heard a lot, of course, about the fact that President Trump withdrew from the Paris Agreement. It is very, very important that President Biden returns to the Paris Agreement in order to state a new vision for US leadership, but also, of course, in order to leverage the considerable political weight the United States has internationally to push other countries towards further leadership. The year 2021 is a pivotal year for the Paris Agreement because it is the year in which all countries around the world are required to update and revise the national climate plans that they established in Paris in 2015. So one of the things that the Paris Agreement does is it says today in December 2015, we agree on certain policies, but we also agree that every 5 years we will come back to the negotiating table and we will have a progressive increase in the ambition of our national climate policies. That 5-year cycle happens now. So what the US needs to do in 2021 is it needs to come back to the negotiating table with a much broader and deeper ambition than it had in 2015. But it must go beyond that. The United States, for example, must give its fair share to the Green Climate Fund, which provides money to decarbonize to developing countries and least developed countries right around the world. It must also show leadership within aviation and maritime negotiations around the world so that we can decarbonize the logistics and the transportation of goods and services right around the world. And it must also look at something called the Kigali Amendment, which looks beyond carbon dioxide and actually tackles very serious additional greenhouse gas emissions that are called short-lived climate pollutants, some of which have extremely detrimental impacts on public health. One of the things I said is that the president needs to create an environmentalism of everyday life. There's an increasing feeling that environmentalism is an elite pursuit, often something that is the priority and the concern of middle class and prosperous people who want to see wildlife reserves protected so that they can go on ecotourism holidays. They want to protect polar bears in the Arctic, animals that most of us will never see, but that they don't care about the daily challenges of working people. They don't care about deindustrialization. They don't care about globalization. They don't care about the fact that there are communities in our own region who have faced crisis after crisis after crisis over the last decades and do not have the time or luxury to focus on yet another crisis, the climate crisis. So one of the things the president has to do is to create a vision of climate change that is about economic development and that is about job creation. And the good news is all of the stats, all of the data back up this argument, because the high carbon economy does not actually create jobs. The jobs in that high carbon economy have been dying for years. And the money we spend in that high carbon economy does not go into the pockets of workers. It goes to buy resources. So if you look, for example, renewable energy not only creates more jobs than fossil fuels, but it also creates higher paying jobs than fossil fuels because we're not paying for access to a resource, we're actually paying people a decent living wage. So according to international statistics, we can create millions of new jobs, not just in transport, not just in energy, not just in agriculture, but right across our economy. And that is a message that needs to get out to the public at large. This is not about protecting wildlife. This is about creating a shared prosperity. We need to return to science. And I don't just mean Trump supporters need to return to science. There is a laziness in the center and center left of US politics that thinks it is the center right and the Trumpists who have abandoned facts and that we on our side of the argument are always loyal to the science. I can tell you from personal experience in recent weeks that when facts confront beliefs, when you try to persuade someone with a factual argument to give up something that they want to believe, they will choose what they want to believe rather than the facts. So we on our side have got to model adherence to the science, even when it's unpalatable. We have got to model that because we cannot hope that the other side will embrace science and follow what the science tells us if we're not willing to do it ourselves. But one of the things that has to happen, the president needs to lead on this, is we must start from a common understanding of shared facts and then build from there. That means we will have disputes still, but we will be doing and having those disputes from a position of shared facts. We need to build a societal consensus. We can only achieve so much by having 4 years of democratic rule that is progressive on climate, followed by 4 years or 8 years of Republican rule that takes us back. We're talking here about a vision that goes to 2050 and arguably goes to the end of this century. Everyone on this call knows that at some point during that journey, we will have another Republican Congress and another Republican president. Therefore, we cannot go on feeling splendidly isolated, feeling self-righteous, that we know what to do on this issue while ignoring the fact that 50% of the country does not agree with us. We have got to now begin to reach out and persuade those who are not persuaded. Because as President Kennedy famously said about the moonshot, it will not be one man landing on the moon, it will be the entire nation. And similarly, the low carbon, inclusive and resilient economy will not be built by one president, it will not be built by one party, it has to be built by all of us. That means learning what incentivizes, what motivates, what inspires those who don't agree with us, and doing whatever we can to try and reach them. It also means, however, that we must save the Republican Party. Because if you cannot be persuaded to wear a mask, if you cannot be persuaded to accept the results of a democratic election, then you cannot be persuaded to go on this journey to a low carbon, resilient and inclusive future. So one of the things that we need more than anything else is not someone like me, a social democrat from Ireland, but we need conservative, evangelical voices who are willing to step up and take a leadership role on this particular issue and to speak truth to their colleagues so that we have more people on the center right of US society who are willing to embark on this journey as well. I'm going to actually begin to wrap up and say the last thing. I have for all of my career tried to be extremely optimistic. There is always a tendency when talking about the climate crisis to speak about the coming apocalypse and to try and motivate people from a sense of fear of the future rather than a sense of optimism as to what type of future we can build. President Kennedy, I think, summed this up when he said that the American by nature is optimistic. He is experimental and a builder who builds best when called upon to build greatly. We are now being called upon to build greatly because this particular task ahead of us will not be easy. But I must, however, confess that I personally have lost a great deal of my optimism over the course of recent months, and particularly over the course of the last 24 hours. So whereas normally I conclude my presentations by talking about optimism, I'm actually now going to take a leaf out of the book of Michael J. Fox, who himself has been optimistic in the face of dreadful adversity, but has recently began to speak about how his optimism is finite. And so instead of talking about optimism, he suddenly speaks about gratitude. And gratitude means looking at the present and deciding how we build from here with clear eyes, as opposed to being optimistic and spending too much time perhaps embracing a possible future rather than building the necessary future. So I'm going to conclude today by being grateful for the fact that on the 20th of January, we have a chance at a new beginning, but that new beginning is only possible if every single one of us are activated. These climate talks are not entertainment. These climate talks are a call to activism. And so everybody who has been on this call tonight, if you have a sense that this is a journey for you, then let's all start that journey tomorrow by getting serious in our activism. I'm sorry if I spoke for too long. I included some things that maybe I wasn't supposed to. I got a little political, but thanks everybody for your attention. And I guess Violet or Ray, I hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Ed. That was very well said. I'd like to loop in at this point our wonderful panelist collection and start with asking each of you really the following question. What really intrigued you and got you interested in this topic? What about climate change sparks your interest? And was that a moment in time? Has that been a gradual awareness? And what I'm really trying to get at is, why does it matter to you? And just as importantly, why should other people care? And Jillian, I'll start with you from an educator perspective who works with a lot of our young students locally.
So in terms of my interest in this from like an academic and, a teacher's perspective is there's so much hope in youth. So where Edward just wrapped up saying he's now grateful, I'm grateful for the young people that I work with because they are the optimists. I mean, they have their whole futures in front of them. And within the climate crisis, there are so many opportunities for success if you can channel that youthful optimism towards real and relevant work. And I think that's what all of our students want, is they want the work they're doing in schools to mean something to them and their peers and the future. So my work with students is really to figure out in each of my classes with each of my students, what's motivating to them and where's the opportunity for positive change that they're encountering, and then to really look at the scope of what they can do. So, you know, we work and talk a lot about leveraging systems change. So if you want to take on, you know, hunger, having a bake sale isn't a great way to do that, but advocating and starting to learn how to speak publicly at town meeting, or learning about the systems of food banks as band-aids to larger problems, like getting at the systemic issues in America that have kept us here. You know, they want to know what really makes a difference, because they know the bake sales don't. In the end, it can be a means to an end. It can raise awareness, but it's not really starting to make change. So.
Great. Elliot, I'll hop onto you. So Ethan, your thoughts on how you became interested in this and why we should care?
With all due respect, I'll admit some level of discomfort with the question itself, in the sense that my interest in this context is almost positioned as though I'm addressing this as a pastime, which I don't consider that I do. I grew up across the streets, or I guess across 2 streets from the San Diego Zoo. And I realized even in my youth how odd it was that my connection to life other than human life, or plants, or lichens, was the enclosed animals in that zoo. So I think from there, I was always thinking about the environmental relations as much as my mind could comprehend, as much information as was fed to me or I digested. I then was my comprehension of systems was of course growing. Okay, now I'm studying environmental justice, environmental philosophy, public action as a part of my the diverse curriculum at Bennington. But I don't know. I don't even want to suggest like why you should care about this thing, because I don't think there's a blanket statement that is really sufficient to the task. But I think about this on a geological time span. A poet, Robinson Jeffers, introduced me to this concept when I was very young. He speaks in his poetry about the rocks and the ocean, and even the ecology of space, the moon, and how no matter what happens to the human race, these things will remain. And he's criticized often as being deeply cynical. And I disagree with that. I also disagree that to be hopeful is always necessarily a virtue. I don't know that I have a specific desired outcome for a solution to climate crisis, because I know that it will not really meet the intensity and the I think also like the poeticness of what actually are people engaging in their everyday lives in ways that they might not consider. Breaking thresholds of the environment, or breaking atmospheric thresholds or thresholds for another species. I could get in my car and break some kind of threshold for some kind of environment, but the IPCC doesn't necessarily note that in their work. But I consider that as a part of my being. So maybe this is becoming too tangential. I can't give you a reason to hope, but I do know that for my life, about 60% of my life is considering climate change in every gesture of my hand when it fetches the water bottle. And it's with me when I walk through the street. So it's infused in everything I do. And I hope that for those of you really interested in evaluating your own internal situation, and also what is beyond yourself, which is most things, that you learn and you hear and you receive and you also listen.
Thank you, Ethan. I'm going to move on to our next Bennington College student. Sorcha, what are your thoughts on the question?
I think Ethan put it really nicely about the love for like creatures and animals. For me, like it started with being really obsessed with my dogs and loving them, spending a lot of time with them. And my father also had a really interesting way of explaining nature and trees and these animals and how we are treating them to me. And it just like
I didn't
drew me in.
understand
And I think for me, I truly understood climate change only when I went to college. But like all the systems and how like it's affecting how it's growing. But I've always felt very strongly for like plants and animals, and how like in my country, like dogs and stray dogs are being man's best friend are not even treated properly. And it's just like other animals are not even in part of the conversations. We're all trapped in just finding ways to grow money or like find food, which is essential. But there was never really like a compassion towards those creatures. And I think that kind of drew me to environmental science. And for me, like the reason why one should be interested or like should give importance to this subject is not because it's now a matter of just safety, not because it's a duty, but it's like it's kindness and this affinity to life, and like a sense of like putting a positive impact and nurturing those other than just not just the human population, but that there's like a whole life much beyond like than us, and just respecting that.
Building on that, Ed, you mentioned twice in your presentation that this isn't an environmental problem, but a human problem. And I'd love to get the thoughts of both yourself and the panelists around how reframing this might build greater consensus and bring more people under the tent and create a space where climate change as a topic wasn't as highly polarized or politicized an issue.
Yeah, I'm happy to comment on that. So I fundamentally believe that the science is not a matter of opinion, but your philosophy and what motivates you and what incentivizes you and what makes you get up in the morning. All of these things that Ethan talked about. I love the idea of, 60% of his life, his being is just this issue. It's not a conscious choice, it's in his bones. Those things are all personal to us. And equally, they're all legitimate in their own way. So whereas, for example, our fellow panelists have talked about their climate awakening coming from the environment, my climate awakening did not come from the environment. It came from the fact that I grew up in a poor community surrounded by unemployment and surrounded by people who never had an opportunity in life because the system did not provide them with an opportunity. They were not less clever than everybody else. They were not less worthy than everybody else. They just weren't invested in. So my coming to this issue is from a social or human perspective. Somebody else might come to this from an environmental perspective. And everybody that we have to motivate out there in the wider world, they have their own individual philosophies that are all as legitimate as ours. And where the science is not up for negotiation, what I think is important is that we spend the time listening to them. we spend the time to understand them, and through listening and understanding, we will then find a way of reaching them through communication. If we only communicate what excites us, if we only communicate what motivates us, we will only reach other people like us, and that just won't be enough. So I do feel that there's a very strong distinction between the science, which I will not cede ground on. I stick rigidly to that, and the philosophy, which is always up for debate.
I think another piece that's like, that gets to this, like what's up for debate, is really how we react to what the science is demanding from us. So it's been worthwhile to follow what's going on with the Global Warming Solutions Act, which is a Vermont law that passed in September. It was passed over Governor Phil Scott vetoed it, and the Senate and the House overrode his veto. And this piece of legislation includes a call for a just transition of our energy portfolio in Vermont. So between now and December 1st of 2021, the group of folks gathering to put this plan into place is considering how we can take into account those opportunities Edward's speaking to. How can we make sure the most vulnerable populations in Vermont are served by this law? And if not, there is a mechanism in the law to start to hold our government accountable. So I'm really hopeful to see where the Solutions Act takes us as a state. Vermont's a very small place, but that does mean it's a little bit easier for us to access our communities, to be present at public hearings, to give testimony to our lawmakers, so that our work can influence others and the direction our policy goes.
For those of you who are following along in the chat, a lot of the references that our panelists are mentioning and noting are being included by Ray, so you can link directly from those.
I will also add, in terms of policies, Violet, do you consider this to be an appropriate time to reveal a criticism of mine of the Biden-Sanders?
Please, absolutely.
I do think that given the scope of the issue, which is, right, this is considered the 6th extinction between millennia, that it is short-sighted. And I'm not supposing that we as humans, or those who are policymakers, or those of us here, are thinking a million years from now. But with something like the climate crisis, to posit solutions, I think it's important one must posit solutions for centuries, but also to not lock one into a centuries-long problem, such as nuclear energy, for example. I use nuclear as an example because that is referred to in the Biden-Sanders Unity Task Force document. And similarly, digital infrastructures, which are not very richly discussed in the mainstream climate, or even in a lot of niche climate debates, because so much the debate is overshadowed by emissions. And I'm not setting emissions aside as an unimportant center necessarily, but once we realize that that is the center, that it dominates conversations to the point where it might also hinder one's ability as a policymaker to consider something like the effects of digital media. And by media, I mean it's computing term, not in terms of news. I mean something that stores data. So as a physical object, how, for example, are the infrastructures to bridge the digital divide, as stated by the United Nations? How is that begetting new infrastructures in the future, say in wow, I just forgot what year it is. 100 years from now, right? In 2100, what kinds of technologies will those infrastructures that are in place currently and that we're utilizing even in the time of COVID beget? Why is this important? Or maybe that's not an important question, but where is this coming from? An idea that funds media studies fundamentally is that infrastructures beget new infrastructures. So if you see digital infrastructures in place today, you can refer back to history. Only 100 years ago, or even farther into the Gilded Age, where telegraph lines, then telephone lines, then undersea cables, they're placed on the same, those placed after the infrastructures before them are in the same spot. So I do think that we might not be considering the carbon emissions that come from these digital infrastructures, also the materiality of them. What is the mining? What is the implications for biodiversity and for space, and also for communities? Who is reaping the benefits of such technologies? It's mainly the global north, who is, whether it's extraction from lithium mines in Chile or Argentina or Bolivia. And I'm not suggesting that, too, we narrow our scope to the other country, right? But I do think it's important that we consider, what are we establishing with these policies like nuclear and like digital infrastructures, which are going to go beyond even our considerations or our problems right now with fossil fuels. And I don't see that addressed, and that intensely concerns me.
I'm excited to add yet another generational voice to this evening's conversation. We have a student from the Long Trail School, Jonah May Neary, who has a question for the audience. So do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yes. Okay. Just let me know if I cut out at all, really. And I mean, I feel like I kind of thought about this question, and maybe asking this question a little selfishly. And I guess I kind of thought about this really in thinking more like directed towards the panelists. But I was really just wondering, you know, how influential is the voice and the actions of my generation of the youth? I mean, what really is the scope and impact of the youth, and what change can we make if my generation, at least, if we can reach a generational consensus versus, you know, the societal consensus that you talked about during your presentation? You know, really, how much can we do? Because I know something that, you know, when I talk to my peers and when I talk about what we can do at our age, there are a lot of limitations, I feel like. And they also feel that sometimes we feel as if our own voices can be silenced oftentimes, and that they feel that even if they try to do these things or try to make change and do action now and make change now, that because of our age, you know, it wouldn't matter, or it wouldn't be quite as important as if world leaders or influential politicians did it.
I think that's a fantastic question. And when we were preparing for this evening, we discussed amongst ourselves, what can the individual do at the micro level and at the macro level? And so Ed, I'll let you take first stab at that one.
Wow, okay, great question. I'm going to get into some trouble, I suspect, with some members of the audience with my answer. The first thing I would say is, this is not about who you are as a generation. This is about who you are as a person. So we make a big mistake when we say that the boomers are responsible for our environmental state. Well, some are, but not all. And we also make a mistake when we say Generation Z and millennials are going to save us. Well, some are and some won't. So if you look in the world right now, if you look at Finland, for example, the 5 governmental leaders in Finland are women at or under the age of 30. The Prime Minister of Finland is, give or take, 30 to 32 years of age. And her leaders in a coalition government in Finland are all women leading political parties, young women leading political parties. If you go down the road of becoming one of those women, then you will have a huge influence on what our future world looks like. There's also a growing number of young women who are, for example, leading in business. So if you have the opportunity to build a career that lands you in a bank, and by being in that bank, you get to direct more money towards sustainable investing and away from investing in coal, then you will make a really big difference. And I can go on and on and on with illustrations of what you can achieve depending on the career path you decide to go down. Similarly, more generally, one of the reasons why in every industrialized democracy in the world, pensions are very rarely touched, but investments in young people are usually so low, is because people over the age of 65 vote, and people between the age of 18 and 35 don't vote in the same numbers. So if you look, and I bet you'll find it from this past election too, the disparity between how many people of a young age engage in the political process and how many people of an older age engage in the political process is historically very large, and that's right across the industrialized world. So if your generation wants to make a difference, then get out there and vote. And if you can't find somebody to vote for, then get out there and stand for election. Right now, within our financial system, I work with banks all the time, and I know that many banks are making changes about how they invest their money because they're very conscious of where young people want to put their investments. They're very conscious of the fact that today's 18-year-olds are going to be tomorrow's 40-year-olds with investment portfolios, and they're going to sit with their investment managers and say, I don't want my money going to Exxon, and I don't care how much of a profit I get or how much of a dividend I get. I want my money going over here instead. I know, for example, that the CEO of Walmart decided to put in place one of the more ambitious climate strategies, not because he cares about the environment, but because he wants young people to come and shop at Walmart. So I would say there's an awful lot of things that you can do, but I would equally say there's an awful lot of things that you should be wary of. I don't believe, for example, I don't believe that simply protesting, as important as it is, I don't believe that that is going to be the thing that gets politicians and CEOs and companies to pay an awful lot of attention. I've yet to see an awful lot of evidence to suggest that it does. So some of the things that I think young people are engaging with right now, while being very useful channels for their passion and energy and sincerity, and maybe a good foothold into doing something more, is not nearly as important in my view as some of these other things you might engage in.
Jonah May, I'll also just say that Vermont youth have been really influential in terms of making a difference in the work of our legislators. And I put a couple of links in the chat. One is a youth council bill that's being reintroduced again this year. And it, 14 to 20-year-olds can apply to be represented in, within the state legislature. So to work as advisors to our legislators. And also, I can't count the number of times I've brought students to the State House to go to committee, to testify, to present in the articulate, educated way our youth are able to communicate, and seen legislators change their vote, and seen legislators literally take students and bring them to meet other legislators to share their opinions so they can really hear what matters to their constituents. You, whether you're a voter or not, you're a constituent, and working right now to make your voice heard and to stand up for the opinions that you believe in, it does make a difference to our legislators. And I don't know what town you're from, but most of the legislators in our area are really receptive. They will come to your class. They will talk with you and your teachers about the issues you care about. And I would say if you're not meeting your legislators, you should work to do that too.
Just one very quick response. I agree with everything you've said. And on top of that, we need much, much bigger change now, much, much bigger change. So for example, when I hear the students from BBA or the students from Long Trail, I'm always amazed, even to this day, at how eloquent you are and how passionate you are and how capable you are. It's astonishing to me because I wasn't that way at your age, and I don't know many of my peers who were. So I think you have the opportunity to think bigger than just going to Montpelier and talking to a legislator. I think you should be the Attorney General of the state of Vermont. And I think as Attorney General of the state of Vermont, you should join with other Attorney Generals to make sure that Massachusetts versus EPA is protected. And I think you have the capacity to be the next tech inventor that comes up with a low carbon solution so that we don't have to rely on nuclear energy. So yes, do all of that, but we've now reached a point where that is not enough. So think bigger.
Yeah, and I think I'd also, onto that, I'd like to add that apart from all this, it's so important to be an active, simply a community member too, because then you know what is going on in your community, in the ecology and ecosystem you're surrounded with. And the little kinds of act that we do, maybe trying to go zero waste and try talking about it with your friends, it slowly starts to resonate and it keeps on adding one at a time. And just one, in the end, like when you look at a bigger picture, it's just one human trying to do it. But the kinds of like this interest and the importance that you keep on sharing keeps on multiplying, and you keep on learning from other people as well. And I think for me, like that has been really inspiring, just my friends like supporting me, teaching me, and me sharing knowledge, and it keeps on increasing. And I think it's beyond just policy and just it doesn't just end with like voting. Coming from a country where it has been politically unstable for a long time, I know that a lot of like community action and these crazy maybe business ideas that you have, or a nonprofit organization kind of idea that you have, is something you need to rely on. And really, I think focusing on grassroots movement is also really important at this time. Yeah.
Can I ask, Ed, can I ask you a quick question related to this in terms of youth? Well, something in my reviewing of the Biden-Sanders and also in your presentation, something that hasn't been mentioned is the environmental and social effects of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And I'm not going to suggest that I know a lot about the intricacies of, but it does frighten me that many of the solutions that are often suggested, and many of the solutions that you all suggest in your presentation, come down to the state and the system that we have in America already, and that young people can aspire to a level of bureaucracy, which I'm not suggesting is necessarily negative. However, it does trouble me that technological solutions and solutions to depend on the state are often like seen as the only solution. So then I also am wondering if Biden and Sanders are considering the effects of the military-industrial complex. So I guess it's two questions.
So for the first question, I think what we need to do over the course of the next 10 years and the next 30 years, that's really the two time horizons we have, is we need a fundamental systems change. We need to change our political system and we need to change our economic system. And if we can change those two systems, we're well on the way to getting where we need to be. I think there's an open debate, and this is an open debate within every social movement, probably going back through time. There's an open debate as to whether you evolve the system or whether you use revolution to overthrow the system. Again, that comes down to a philosophical choice, and it also comes down to what you think is the right theory of change. Now, I happen to believe that the right theory of change is probably to work within the system that we have now, but I'm also open to the fact that I might be wrong about that. There have been times in the past where evolution has not been sufficient and there has to be revolution. I don't think that we're there yet, but there's increasing evidence to suggest that the types of changes that we need to make are changes that very powerful people are resisting and will go on resisting. So I tend to be the type of person who believes that if properly managed, if properly steered, the system can actually be a system that leads us in the right direction, but it does require a generational change of leadership. I don't consider myself to be somebody who recommends technological solutions because I don't think the problem is a technology problem. We have the technology we need. We have the information we need. What we don't have is the leadership we need. And you see that across a range of issues. You see that when a Supreme Court justice is being appointed to the United States Supreme Court, and up on the bench reviewing these nominations are a whole series of people in their mid to late 80s. I think the biggest issue is we need to have a change of guard where more young people who have the same sorts of passions and dispensations and views that all of you have, that you're taking a leadership position so that you can push the system in the direction it needs to go. So I don't think it's a technology solution. I do think it's a political and economic solution. Whether we do that with the current systems or whether those systems need to be changed dramatically, I leave that to everyone's individual philosophy. And then for your second question with the military-industrial complex, I do think that militaries around the world contribute enormously to greenhouse gas emissions, and there's lots and lots of evidence to suggest that. That being said, I'm agnostic as to where solutions come from. So if solutions to the problem come from there, or if solutions to the problem come from elsewhere, from places that I disagree with, I'm agnostic about that because I'm in the business of trying to solve a problem. I'm not in the business of solving a problem by creating a new problem. And that's something that you've touched on earlier, and we have to be very mindful of. And there are many examples historically of how we've tried to solve the climate crisis through, for example, biofuels. And while reducing emissions, we've exacerbated food insecurity and food poverty. So we mustn't create more problems by solving these ones. But when it comes to my own world, I'm agnostic about where they come from. I'm in the business of solving problems. And that also means, I have to say, that I'm in the business of working with people, even if they have been part of the problem. I come from Ireland, which has a history of conflict. And being Irish, I'm aware of the fact that no conflict has ever been solved without involving the combatants. Mm-hmm. So you don't solve the problem of the climate crisis without working with people who pollute. And so we're going to have to do that as well. And if that means we have to get into uncomfortable places and deal with uncomfortable people, then that's the choice I've made, that I'm willing to do that.
I think we have time for one more question. And Will, I'm going to throw it to you because you're asking us to think a little bit outside of the United States and Vermont.
Thank you. I tried to ask this question in the comments, but I sort of botched it. But it seems to me that for at least since the last half of the 20th century, America has been exporting this sort of aspiration for an American lifestyle, consumerism, and we're succeeding. And, now we've got 2 billion people in China and 1 billion people in India who want to consume like Americans, use up resources like Americans, emit waste like Americans. Now that we've made that mess, how are we going to change course and still have it do anything? If we give up carbon emissions, but China and India don't, then what?
Do you want me to start with that, Violet?
If you feel kind, yes.
Okay, there's a couple of things I would say about that. The first is, it's important to bear in mind that 23% of all Chinese emissions are embedded in goods and services that are sold to the global north, predominantly to the United States. Just like 82% of all the oil produced in Saudi Arabia is exported to 5 countries. Just like there are tankers off the coast of Venezuela right now lined up to take the oil out of Venezuela and bring it to those same 5 countries. So we have a tendency, and I'm not suggesting you're doing this, Will, but we have a tendency to point our finger at other parts of the world when in fact those other parts of the world are sustaining our own high carbon addiction. That's the first thing. Emissions are rising in China, but the first thing to bear in mind is a lot of those emissions rises are to fuel and satisfy our own consumption. Another thing that I would say is that greenhouse gas emissions live in the atmosphere for a long time. And so even though China is the largest annual polluter, if you look at cumulative emissions, the United States is way out in front of China and way out ahead of every other country to boot, because some of the greenhouse gases can stay in the atmosphere for up to 1,000 years. So we have modeled a high carbon economy and a high carbon lifestyle, and we cannot simply, and many people on the conservative side of the political debate try to suggest that it's no longer our fault, it's now China's fault. The third thing is, if you look at per capita emissions, the average emissions of an individual living in the United States and living in a 5-bedroom home and driving an SUV and flying to Europe for holidays and eating hamburgers and so on and so forth, vastly, vastly larger than the average emissions of the average person living in China. So per capita emissions are far higher here than they are there. So the first thing I think we need to do is to understand, as Ethan has also mentioned previously, that our own lifestyles in the global north, and this goes on with, you know, the mining in Chile that produces the iron that goes into our electric vehicles, our own consumption is driving not only emissions domestically, but it's driving emissions in other parts of the world too. And therefore, we have a responsibility to reduce our own emissions before we point the finger at others. But the principal part of your question is, how can we succeed if they mimic our lifestyle? The simple answer is we can't succeed if they mimic our lifestyle. So one of the trends we're seeing globally at the moment is a rise in the global middle class, which means that places like China and India are lifting people out of poverty. And what are those people doing? They're buying cars, they're switching from vegetarian diets to beef, and they're going on cruise ships for their holidays. That is not sustainable. That is simply not sustainable. So again, we have got to go about a fundamental change, not only in the way we produce things, but we do have to have a fundamental change in how we consume things as well. It does have to involve these countries, absolutely, your point is correct. But I think we cannot get to a point where we advocate for that for as long as those countries continue to see us developing in an old high carbon method.
Thank you. And with that, I will wrap things up. You've given us each a lot of food for thought, and I can say I'm both hopeful and grateful, and particularly grateful for this evening and everyone's time, especially the diversity of the audience that we had. It was exactly what Ed and I were hoping for when we were thinking about this this evening. Before I sign off, I just want to hand things off really quickly to Ray, who's going to tell you all a little bit about how to access the resources and references that our brilliant panelists mentioned this evening.
Hi, everyone. First, thank you so much to all of our speakers this evening. I have been sitting behind the scenes, keeping the tech things running, but I've also been immensely enjoying this conversation. I've gotten a couple of private messages about how to access the recording of this talk, and I just wanted to let everyone know that we are going to take a little bit of time to process that and to edit together into a polished product. Then it will become available on the Manchester Community Library's website. So if you watch that page over the next week and change, it should be up sometime roughly next Thursday. The other thing is that all of our panelists and speakers tonight generously put together lists of resources, many of which have appeared in the chat over the course of the conversation, some of which did not. And so if anyone listening tonight is interested in getting the full list of links and readings, we would ask that you email the address that I'm going to put in the chat now to get a copy of that document.
Fabulous.
All right.
Thank you, Ray. And many thanks again for our wonderful panelists and the thoughtful time and energy they put into making this happen, including the Long Trail School. Have a lovely evening.